At the southwestern corner of Lake Michigan, where the vast freshwater inland sea meets the flat prairie of the American Middle West, a city rose from swampland and turned itself, by sheer organizational will, into one of the great metropolises of the modern world. Carl Sandburg called it the City of Big Shoulders, which is as accurate a description as poetry ever managed, but it barely captures what Chicago actually is. This is a city that refused to stay where geography put it. It reversed a river. It lifted itself bodily out of the mud. It burned to the ground and then built taller than before. It took the violence and tragedy and contradiction that American life delivers in concentrated doses to every major city and turned them, sometimes, into music and architecture and a particular sideways toughness that its residents carry like a second coat against the lake wind. Chicago occupies a position at the center of the country, geographically, economically, culturally, that no amount of coastal condescension has ever been able to dislodge. It is the American city that reminds you what ambition looked like before it got polished. This is the story of Chicago. Long before the first European drew a map of the southern tip of Lake Michigan, the portage connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River watershed had been one of the most strategically significant pieces of land on the continent. The Potawatomi people called it Chicago, a name most historians derive from a word in the Miami, Illinois language meaning wild garlic or wild onion, a reference to the pungent plants growing in the marshes around the river's mouth. The Potawatomi were not the only people who understood the portage's value. For centuries, the Odawa, Ojibwe, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, and other nations had traveled and traded through this narrow land bridge between two of North America's greatest waterway systems. The portage was not incidental to the city's future. It was the city's future, compressed into a few miles of wet ground. French missionaries and traders arrived in the 17th century, mapping the portage and recording what they found. The Jesuit priest Jacques Marquette and explorer Louis Joliet passed through in 1673, noted the portage's commercial potential with admirable foresight, and moved on. French influence flickered in the region for decades, always transactional, never quite settling. It took a man of a different background to plant the first permanent roots. Baptiste Point DuSable, of African and possibly French Caribbean heritage, established a substantial trading post at the mouth of the Chicago River sometime around 1790, building not a rough cabin, but a genuine homestead, a house, bakehouse, dairy, smokehouse, poultry house, stable, mill, and barn. He traded with the Potawatomi, spoke multiple languages, and built something that looked, by the standards of the frontier, like permanence. DuSable sold his property in 1800 and moved on. What he left behind was the template for what the location would become, a commercial node at the meeting of water and land, built by a man no one historical narrative quite knew how to categorize. The United States government built Fort Dearborn on the Chicago River in 1803, the military's customary way of announcing that a place mattered. The fort was destroyed during the War of 1812, rebuilt in 1816, and finally abandoned in 1837. By then, it no longer needed to exist. Chicago had been incorporated as a town in 1833 with a population of around 350 people, and incorporated as a city in 1837 with just over 4,000. The portage that native peoples had used for centuries had been converted into an asset for American commerce, and the people who had understood its value longest were being pushed, through a series of treaties signed under increasing duress, entirely out of the picture. The Treaty of Chicago in 1833 compelled the Potawatomi to cede their remaining lands and remove west of the Mississippi. Within a decade, the people for whom Chicago was a name and a home had been stripped of both. What made Chicago grow was water, then iron. Then the combination of the two, applied with a ruthlessness that the 19th century admired as enterprise. The Illinois and Michigan Canal, completed in 1848, connected the Chicago River to the Illinois River and from there to the Mississippi, creating a continuous water route from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The transformation was immediate. Goods that had required expensive overland portage could now move by water, and Chicago sat at the fulcrum of the entire system. Then the railroads arrived. The Galena and Chicago Union Line began service in 1848. Within a decade, Chicago had become the largest railroad hub in the world, with more rail lines converging on it than any other city on Earth. By 1860, 30-odd railroad companies operated out of Chicago. Everything the American interior produced, grain, lumber, cattle, hogs, coal, flowed through the city, and everything the industrializing East produced flowed back the other way. The immigrants followed the work. Irish Catholics arrived first in significant numbers, fleeing the catastrophic famine of the 1840s, taking the hardest and lowest paid construction and slaughterhouse jobs. Germans came in the 1840s and 1850s, many of them skilled craftsmen and merchants. Scandinavians settled in their own communities on the north side. Polish workers arrived, then Lithuanians, Italians, Czechs, and Jews from Eastern Europe, each group carving a neighborhood that became its own small city. Little Poland in the northwest, the Jewish Maxwell Street Market on the near west side, Little Italy south of downtown, Pilsen for the Czechs. By 1870, the population had reached nearly 300,000, and more than half of those residents were foreign-born. By 1890, after the city had annexed 125 square miles of surrounding townships in a single administrative sweep, Chicago had more than 1 million people. It had been a town of 350 for barely 50 years. At the center of this industrial world stood the Union Stockyards, opened on Christmas Day, 1865, on a square mile of land southwest of downtown. Carl Sandburg's famous line, Chicago, hog butcher for the world, was not metaphor. By the 1890s, the stockyards and the packing plants surrounding them processed 9 million animals per year. The 5 major meatpacking firms, Swift, Armour, Morris, Cudahy, Hammond, had built what amounted to an industrial city within a city, with its own rail connections, water supply, and a workforce of tens of thousands living in a cramped neighborhood called Back of the Yards. The companies had discovered that animals could be disassembled along a moving line as efficiently as manufacturers assembled machines, and the disassembly line at the Chicago stockyards, the so-called disassembly line, was one of the direct inspirations for Henry Ford's later automotive assembly work. Chicago was inventing industrial modernity, and it was doing it in blood and ice. The workers who made this possible lived and labored in conditions that Upton Sinclair documented in his 1906 novel The Jungle, arriving there intending to describe human misery and discovering that American readers were more disturbed by what was happening to the food supply than to the workers. The labor movement tried repeatedly to organize the packing houses, and the industry pushed back with equal determination. The Haymarket affair of 1886, in which a bomb thrown at police during a labor rally in downtown Chicago killed several officers and led to the conviction and execution of labor organizers on questionable evidence, became one of the defining events of the American labor movement, celebrated on May Day around the world while being largely forgotten in the country where it happened. Chicago was producing not only meat and steel, but the American argument about what workers were owed. On the night of October 8th, 1871, a fire started in or near a barn on the city's southwest side and found everything it needed to become a catastrophe. The summer had been brutally dry. The city was built almost entirely of wood, wooden houses, wooden sidewalks, wooden water pipes. High winds pushed the fire northeast across the river and into the heart of the business district, where it burned for 2 days until rain extinguished it on October 10th. The damage was almost incomprehensible. 300 people died. More than 100,000 were left homeless. Roughly 17,500 buildings were destroyed across 2,100 acres. The center of the city was gone. What happened next still astonishes. The city rebuilt with a speed and a vision that seemed to exceed what any ordinary emergency could produce. More than 10,000 building permits were issued in the years immediately following the fire. The architects who descended on Chicago, William LeBaron Jenney, Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, John Root, Dankmar Adler, found a city with soaring land values, rising demand for commercial space, and a cultural willingness to try things that had never been tried before. They invented the skyscraper. Jenney's home insurance building, completed in 1885, was the first structure to use a steel frame as its primary load-bearing element, allowing buildings to rise far beyond what masonry walls could support. Terracotta fireproofing replaced the wood that had fed the fire. The Chicago School of Architecture emerged from these years as a philosophy. Function expressed honestly, ornament used with purpose, and height pursued as a statement of commercial confidence. The city that burned became the city where modern architecture was born. 22 years after the fire, Chicago invited the world to see what it had built. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, awarded to Chicago over the competing bids of New York, Washington, and St. Louis, occupied 686 acres of Jackson Park on the South Lakefront and drew more than 27 million visitors in 6 months. Chief architect Daniel Burnham organized a team of the nation's most distinguished designers to construct what newspapers called the White City, a unified ensemble of grand neoclassical buildings in gleaming white plaster, electrically lit at night, served by a moving walkway and a revolutionary new ride designed by George Washington Ferris. A 264-foot rotating wheel carrying 2,160 passengers in 36 enclosed cars that answered the question of how to out-Eiffel the Eiffel Tower in the most literal possible way. The fair announced Chicago's arrival as a world city, a place that had gone from a trading post with 350 residents to a metropolis of 1 million in the span of a single human lifetime, and was now prepared to tell the world about it. It introduced the zipper, juicy fruit gum, Cracker Jack, the dishwasher, and, less celebratorily, the serial killer H.H. Holmes, who operated a hotel near the fairgrounds. Burnham's experience organizing it produced the most ambitious urban planning document in American history, his 1909 Plan of Chicago, which envisioned the lakefront as permanently public land, proposed a system of parks and boulevards radiating outward from the city's center, and established the principle, which Chicago has largely honored, that the miles of lakefront belong to every resident equally, not to developers. Make no little plans, Burnham reportedly said. In Chicago, this was not a slogan, but a civic religion. The city that the immigrants had built began to change again in the years around World War I, when a new migration began, one of the most consequential demographic movements in American history. African Americans from the Deep South, fleeing the violence and legal subjugation of the Jim Crow system, began arriving in Chicago in large numbers, following the Illinois Central Railroad north from Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia. The Chicago Defender, the city's black newspaper, actively recruited Southern readers, running stories about the wages available in Chicago's stockyards and factories, alongside accounts of the legal terror operating in the South. Between 1910 and 1940, Chicago's black population grew from roughly 44,000 to nearly 278,000. The neighborhood on the South Side that absorbed this population became known as Bronzeville, or the Black Metropolis. What Bronzeville built within the constraints that segregation imposed was extraordinary. The neighborhood developed its own banks, insurance companies, newspapers, hospitals, theaters, and nightclubs. Jazz, which had come north from New Orleans on the same railroads that brought the migrants, found its second home on Bronzeville's State Street and on the stretch of 35th Street, known as the Stroll. Louis Armstrong joined King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band at the Lincoln Gardens in 1922 and electrified audiences who had never heard anything like it. The Regal Theater hosted every significant black entertainer of the era. Gwendolyn Brooks wrote poetry here. Richard Wright wrote Native Son here. The Chicago Blues, the amplified, electrified transformation of the Mississippi Delta tradition, developed in Bronzeville's clubs and parlors, producing Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Buddy Guy. The city that had confined its black residents to a narrow strip of the South Side and denied them access to most of its economic opportunities had, inadvertently, created the conditions for one of the most concentrated bursts of cultural creativity in American history. The same years that were producing this cultural flowering on the South Side were producing something darker elsewhere in the city. Prohibition arrived in January 1920, and Chicago responded with a comprehensive, cheerful disregard for the law that was matched in scale only by the violence of the competition for bootlegging territory. By the mid-1920s, there were an estimated 12 major bootlegging operations in the city, and the most powerful of them was controlled by a young man from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone. Al Capone had arrived in Chicago around 1920 at the invitation of his mentor, Johnny Torrio, and when Torrio was shot by a rival gang and retired to Brooklyn, Capone inherited an organization that, by some estimates, was generating $100 million a year, the equivalent of more than $1 billion today, through the sale of illegal alcohol, along with gambling and prostitution. Capone bribed police officers, aldermen, state legislators, and eventually the mayor with such regularity that the city's political corruption and its organized crime became genuinely difficult to distinguish. The beer wars, as the conflicts between Chicago's bootlegging factions were called, killed hundreds of people. The most notorious single incident came on February 14, 1929, when members of Capone's outfit, dressed as police officers, lined up 7 men associated with the rival North Side gang in a North Clark Street garage and shot them. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, as it became immediately and permanently known, cemented Chicago's international reputation for gangland violence. Capone was eventually convicted not of murder or racketeering, but of tax evasion in 1931, sentenced to 11 years, and sent to Alcatraz. His organization survived him. Chicago's relationship with political corruption, machine politics, and the blurred line between official authority and criminal enterprise would outlast Prohibition by several decades. The political machine that governed Chicago through most of the 20th century was one of the most durable and powerful urban political organizations in American history. Richard J. Daley, who served as mayor from 1955 until his death in 1976, was its apotheosis. Daley was an Irish Catholic from the Bridgeport neighborhood on the South Side, who had risen through the Cook County Democratic Organization with the patience and cunning of a man who understood that power in Chicago was built not through dramatic gestures, but through favors, patronage jobs, loyal precinct captains, and the quiet management of a city's 50 wards. At its peak, the Daley machine controlled thousands of city jobs, distributed to supporters, and withheld from opponents. It built expressways and public housing projects that reshaped the city's racial geography, often deliberately, concentrating black residents in high-rise towers on the south and west sides while directing investment toward downtown and white ethnic neighborhoods. It produced tangible results: O'Hare Airport, McCormick Place, a revitalized downtown, alongside the systematic exclusion of large parts of the city's population from its benefits. Then came the summer of 1968, and everything that had been building under the surface of the machine's apparent order broke through. The Democratic National Convention came to Chicago in August of that year, and with it came tens of thousands of anti-war protesters who had spent months organizing against the Vietnam War and the Democratic establishment that was sustaining it. Daley deployed 12,000 Chicago police officers, backed by 15,000 state and federal troops. On the night of August 28th, on Michigan Avenue, in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel, while network television cameras rolled, police waded into crowds of protesters with nightsticks and tear gas, beating demonstrators, bystanders, and journalists alike. The resulting investigation, conducted for the federal government, described what had happened as a police riot, a conclusion that divided the country along precisely the lines that the 1960s had been drawing all decade. What those events said about Chicago was complicated and still contested. The city's political establishment closed ranks around Daley. A generation of Americans watched on television and drew their own conclusions. The convention itself limped to its conclusion, nominated a candidate who lost the general election, and left both the Democratic Party and the city of Chicago with a wound that did not close quickly. While the city's surface politics were producing this spectacle, something quieter and more durable was forming in the clubs and basement parties of Chicago's black and gay communities. In 1977, a DJ from New York named Frankie Knuckles arrived in the city to take up a residency at a club on the near west side called the Warehouse. The Warehouse was an underground venue catering primarily to black and gay men who had few other places to gather safely. And what Knuckles played there, a blend of disco, soul, funk, and European electronic music, manipulated in real time using 2 turntables and a drum machine, was unlike anything anyone could buy in a record store. Knuckles extended intros, layered beats, rebuilt songs into something more hypnotic and propulsive than the originals. Dancers in the Warehouse's long, sweaty rooms responded to it as if it were a physical force. Record stores began fielding requests from customers for the music from the Warehouse, shortened simply to the house. The name stuck. A genre had been named. House music spread from the Warehouse to other clubs, the Music Box, the Power Plant, the Playground, and from those clubs into the city's radio stations, where DJs on WBMX mixed it live on air, in sets that Chicagoans would record on cassettes and play, until the tape wore through. By the mid-1980s, it had reached the United Kingdom, where it detonated in the clubs of Manchester and London. By the late 1980s, it had spread to every corner of the world, becoming the foundation on which techno, drum and bass, garage, trance, and virtually every other form of electronic dance music was built. Every pulsing dance floor in Ibiza or Berlin or São Paulo that is running a 4/4 kick drum at 130 beats per minute owes a debt, acknowledged or not, to a juice bar on Jefferson Street in Chicago's West Loop, and to a DJ who called what he was doing disco's revenge. By the time the 21st century arrived, Chicago had produced something it did not plan for and could not quite categorize. A United States senator from Hyde Park named Barack Obama, who had come to the city in 1985 as a community organizer on the far south side, attended law school, returned to teach constitutional law at the University of Chicago, entered state politics, and was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004 in a landslide so large it was visible from space. In November 2008, standing in Grant Park, a few blocks from the site where police and protesters had clashed 40 years before, Obama addressed a crowd of more than 240,000 people who had gathered to hear him speak after his election as the 44th President of the United States. The first African American to hold that office had built his career in the city whose Great Migration had created the largest black community in the American North. Chicago today is a city of 2.7 million people, inside the city limits, and nearly 10 million in the metropolitan area, the 3rd largest in the United States. The lakefront that Burnham protected in 1909 is still public, still crowded with cyclists and runners and families on summer days when the city becomes briefly the most beautiful place in the Midwest. The neighborhoods are still distinct. Pilsen's still Mexican, Andersonville still Scandinavian in its bones, if not its current demographics. Hyde Park still the intellectual enclave the University of Chicago made it. The blues clubs on the north side are still going. The architecture is still the best in the country. The politics are still complicated. What never changes is the city's conviction that it has something to prove. That conviction was born in a swamp at a portage, sharpened by a fire, and confirmed by everything that came after. Chicago has never been certain it was finished, and that uncertainty has been its greatest strength. The reason it built skyscrapers from ashes, fed a nation from a square mile of stockyards, played jazz until the sun came up on State Street, and invented, in an underground club with no windows, the sound that the whole world eventually danced to.